Good evening and welcome to a Midwestern Geek in Cali. This podcast is being recorded at 42 Tardis Way in lovely Temecula, California, which is also in the desert, and that is highly appropriate to this evening's recording. The subject of this recording is a tribute to the guy who started. Basically, he was the first that I know of on the subjects that I like to cover. And in his honor, since he was an AM radio talk show host, this podcast episode 40, is being recorded in mono because AM radio never had stereo. Some of you who know of this man may have guessed what I'm covering this evening already, and the news is rather sad. Radio talk show host Art Bell, as the Washington Post called him, the mysterious narrator of the American nightscape, died at his home in rural Nevada at the age of 72 this past Friday. And as the Washington Post obituary appropriately notes, he passed away on Friday the 13th. So, this episode is a tribute to Art Bell, and I will talk to you a little bit about Mr. Bell after a little bit of an introduction. In this intro, you'll find out a little bit about me, and you'll find out a little bit about Art Bell. This episode isn't really going to be a good one for listening to while you're driving, I don't think. It's going to probably evoke some visualization, and I'm not sure if you should be operating any kind of heavy equipment. Maybe driving might be okay. You might want to consider it. But that's how I was first introduced to Art Bell, driving. So for that, we're going to have to point out one of the inconsistencies in the Washington Post article because they said his show Coast to Coast AM started in 1989. Well, let's just prove them wrong. It might have been a different version of his show that started earlier than that, but I know for a fact that Art Bell was on the radio much earlier than that. And so for this, we're going to go back in time a little bit. We're going to go back in time to the year 1980. And we have a young 18-year-old airman, freshly graduated from technical school at Lowry Air Force Base in Denver, Colorado, which was actually in the Denver suburb of Aurora. It now no longer exists. It was torn down a few years ago, but at the time it was an active training base in Aurora, Colorado, a suburb of Denver. And leaving Denver, this young airman is driving an old 1966 Dodge Dart GT with a tiny 273 cubic inch V8, and it had been snowing for 48 hours and 56 minutes nonstop just prior to when I left. I left Denver, and there was easily a foot or more of snow on the ground, probably closer to 16 inches on the ground. and I hit the interstate highway going east towards Wisconsin. I got as far as Nebraska in the middle of the night, probably about 2 o'clock in the morning. And this Dodge Dart had nothing but an AM radio in it. It was that old. There was no FM radio in this. It had the original factory radio from when it was manufactured in 1966, and FM radio didn't even really exist yet. Or if it did, it was in its early infancy. So I'm running through the dial, and there's not much on but a little bit of country radio, maybe some gospel, and some political talk. And all of a sudden, I come across this voice talking about flying saucers on the AM radio in the middle of the night. Now, flying saucers in 1980 were a very woo woo kind of subject. Nobody talked about flying saucers unless they wanted to be ridiculed. And here was a fellow talking on the radio in a perfectly professional, calm voice about flying saucers with a guest. And at 1 o'clock in the morning, I'm driving down the highway in Nebraska, down the interstate. And about every 50 feet, I'm plowing through a 4-foot snowdrift. And then I'd get back up to 55 miles an hour and plow through another snowdrift. And I'm listening to Art Bell and his guest. I don't remember who it was. This is a long time ago. We're talking 38 years ago. Discussing alien abduction and UFOs. Finally, I hit a snowdrift and the car went from humming along to I had ripped the muffler out from under the car. And I saw a motel sign with a vacancy, $11 a night for a small roadside motel, and I took it. But I was intrigued with the radio show. So the next day, I got back in my old 1966 Dodge Dart GT that now had no muffler underneath of it. That was left in a snowdrift in Nebraska somewhere, along with the tailpipe. And I, armed with a bunch of Coca-Cola and no-dos, took off down the road, heading for Wisconsin. And late that night, a little after midnight or around midnight, on comes the Art Bell show. The stars are out, clear skies, cold, but clear. And the night at that time, I don't know, there's something about it. Your mind is open. You see up into the night skies, and it was out in the country. You could see a million stars, a billion. And you have to wonder at what all is out there. And Art Bell gets a guest on, and they're talking about, oh, I can't remember. It must have been one of the weather control conspiracies or something of that nature. But he would get one or two callers that were interesting. on his show and interesting discussions. And so it stuck with me because I grew up watching Star Trek. I grew up with Star Wars being an incredible new movie, groundbreaking special effects. I grew up with movies like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which I'm not sure was even out yet at that time. And one of my favorite songs on the radio in that era was Billy Thorpe's Children of the Sun, which, if you've ever listened to that song, is highly appropriate to this topic. So I went home to Wisconsin, had my leave, visited with my family for a month, and headed down to my duty station in New Mexico, Clovis, New Mexico, near the Texas Panhandle, about 15 miles west of the Texas Panhandle. And on the way, I ran into fog in Oklahoma, and I had some other adventures. I don't really want to get into that now, but the skies cleared, and in Oklahoma and New Mexico, the night skies are incredible. You could see the Milky Way very plainly. And Art Bell was on at 3 o'clock in the morning with a fellow named Red Elk. And they were talking spiritual issues, aliens, beings from other dimensions, beings from other worlds. And let me tell you, that was right up my alley. Now, I'd never seen a UFO, but after watching Star Trek as a kid, after watching the Apollo moon landing live in summer school in the summer of '69 in class, because my teacher rolled it out on a black and white TV and said, "You kids have to see this. This is history in the making." After watching Star Wars in high school, after reading hundreds of science fiction books from the time I was 10 years old until now, even. Yeah, I've probably read thousands and thousands of science fiction books by now. Having read comic books since I was in preschool, at least the pictures. And then as soon as I got in school and learned to read, the whole story. This was right up my alley. Now, I don't necessarily agree with Art Bell on politics, and in some cases I might not disagree, because politically he was pretty far spread out. Looks wise, I would say Art Bell reminds me a little bit of Leonard Nimoy with glasses, and his voice sounds a little bit similar to Leonard Nimoy's to me. But I would bet you anything that the reason we have movies like Batteries Not Included, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, TV shows like The X-Files and Fringe, or Twin Peaks, or that stuff that's a little bit out there. Well, if the truth is out there, so are the mysteries. And in the middle of the night, everything is mysterious and possible and impossible. And the impossible can be possible. And Art Bell was the first one to talk about that on the radio and kept me company on some very long solo drives across country. We're talking 1,900 miles, maybe, at least 1,300, at least 1,300. So, to quote a few facts from the Washington Post article, and one thing that I think the obituary writer said brilliantly: in the small of the night, when the mind is open and the defenses are eased, mysteries blossom and conspiracies run wild. Mr. Bell was 72. He died on Friday, April 13th, at his home in Pahrump, Nevada. He had a peak of 400 radio stations with his show Coast to Coast AM in the 1990s. And he built his own studio at home in the beginning. And he achieved a listenership of 10 million listeners a week. He began broadcasting in the military. He was a Marine medic and picked up some broadcasting work in the military, I believe in Japan, and started there with politics. And then he got tired of politics and went on to the really fun and cool stuff. He wrote a book called The Quickening, and Art Bell even saw a UFO with his wife, as did I once. He also held a Guinness World Record for the longest time staying on air for a DJ at 116 hours nonstop. That's incredible. That's like being on the air for a week straight. He also held the record for seesawing while broadcasting at 57 hours. Yeah. It was amazing. He was a first. He was a first, and I'll tell you right now, he's really a background inspiration for why I would do a podcast like this. Why tech? Why paranormal? Why science fiction and comic books and stuff on the edge? And why local entrepreneurship? Because Art Bell was a small business entrepreneur in his own right, turned successful and large. It's a pretty amazing story, and it's original. He was really, as far as I can tell, the first of his kind to seriously tackle these subjects. You can take a look at what's on Gaia TV. It used to be Gaiam TV, and you can attribute the existence of that directly back to Art Bell in many ways, and indirectly as well. Yeah. My ringtone on my phone is still the X-Files, and I don't think I would have had the X-Files to watch if it weren't for Art Bell and his show, or in whatever iteration it took over the years. But I can tell you, he was on the radio long before 1989, and he was doing really cool stuff long before 1989. And his voice will be missed. So with that, Mr. Bell, may the universe be open to you, and may you long be remembered here on earth. Good night, and thank you for listening to a Midwestern Geek in Cali podcast. And you can find us at www.midwesterngeekandcali.com. Thank you, and happy Vulcan fingers to you from the agent of 42. Good night.